Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about something that I really hate. Needles. I really don't like needles, and the last time I had to get blood drawn, I almost passed out walking back to the waiting room. I don't know why, but they just really weird me out. But anyway, we're not here to talk about my fear of needles, we're here to talk about how someone became horribly addicted to needles and injections in general. It just so happens that that person happens to be one of the most infamously evil people in history, Adolf Hitler. This is something that has become more commonly known in the last 10 years or so after the book Blitzed by Norman Ohler was released in 2015 and subsequently became a New York Times bestseller. I have read this book and I found it to be quite interesting. It does have an issue of jumping away from the story to talk about Ohler's research, which is kind of unnecessary, and it can make some rather unnecessary assumptions that aren't really needed, but regardless, I do think it's a decent enough read, and great for more casual readers. It's the general idea of drug use in Nazi Germany that I want to look at today, but instead focusing on Hitler himself. How exactly did his addiction to injections and various drugs come about? Was it just a single drug or something more? Who is to blame for his drug addiction? And what was the end result of his drug addiction? Now, before we answer these questions, we need to first point something out about Hitler. Hitler was reportedly a massive hypochondriac, a vegan, and abstained from smoking and alcohol as much as possible during his adult years. Hitler's hypochondria was also reportedly greatly exacerbated by the death of his mother back in 1907, who died as a result of the strange cancer treatment she received. Apparently, the cancer was directly treated with iodoform, I think that's how that's pronounced, soaked gauze, which led to throat paralysis and ultimately poisoned and killed her. Now, keep this event in the back of your mind and we'll return to it a little bit later, as I do think it may be important, but for now, let's move on to Hitler's introduction to the man who would basically be his drug peddler. Looking into this, our story begins in 1936, Hitler having been Chancellor of Germany for the past 3 years, and we find him at a dinner party. Hitler, then suffering from stomach cramps and severe gas, was rather desperate for some kind of cure. That's when he was introduced to Dr. Theodore Morell, a doctor that, spoiler alert, was viewed by many in Germany and even among Hitler's entourage as a complete quack and hack of a doctor. Morell would prescribe Hitler a combination of Mutaflor pills and Dr. Koster's anti-gas pills. Surprisingly, Hitler's condition rapidly improved and his stomach issues quickly faded away. Hitler was incredibly impressed at how quickly he improved, and later came to Morell for issues of lethargy, something he could ill afford being the firebrand leader that he was. Morell then began injecting Hitler with a substance he called Vitamulin, along with some glucose. Injected with this, Hitler immediately felt refreshed, invigorated, energized, and other various synonyms. As Morell had cured Hitler of his stomach issues and his lethargy, Hitler began to view Morell as sort of a medical genius, as the only man who actually understood medicine and how to cure him. As a result, Hitler would appoint Morell to be his personal doctor in 1937, a position he would hold into the very last few days of the war in 1945. So in that initial treatment, what was in the Mutaflor, the gas pills, and the Vitamulin that brought Hitler to good health? The first two drugs do have some kind of legitimacy to them, so I guess a broken clock is right twice a day. The Mutaflor was basically just specially cultured strains of E. coli bacteria to help improve the intestinal flora. While E. coli has a very bad rap for being something that's not good to have on food, this is actually still a sort of thing that happens today, perhaps not in this manner, but it is a legitimate medical treatment for people that don't have proper intestinal flora. The gas pills, on the other hand, were more accepted treatment at the time, but today are recognized to be rather harmful. This is because the pills given to Hitler contained both nightshade and strychnine, I think that's how it's pronounced, a lot of weird words today, both of which are very toxic. While it was more accepted back then, which is why I understand why it was used, it was still, more than likely, harmful in some fashion. In fact, a doctor brought in to treat Hitler in 1944 for a different ailment began taking the pills in the amount that Hitler was prescribed and found that they've made him feel pretty bad. Then there's the Vitamulin and glucose injections. Now, these injections early on were likely given to Hitler every now and then, once every few days, or when Hitler needed energy for an event. Morell claimed that the Vitamulin contained only vitamins and nothing else. However, it was later tested by other doctors in Hitler's inner circle, and it was found to include methamphetamine. Yes, to wake himself up, Hitler had Morell inject him with some meth, which, yeah, probably would wake you up and give you some energy. Considering what else was in it, I kind of feel like the glucose wasn't really necessary to add to it, but whatever, maybe there is some legitimate medical reason for that. I'm not a doctor. Now, at this point, Hitler wasn't at the point where he was truly addicted to injections and various other drugs, but he became increasingly reliant on them as the years went on. The big shift that turned Hitler into an addict of all kinds of injected substances would not come until the 1940s, after probably two specific events. The first event occurred in 1941 after Hitler became ill, and these standard injections of Vitamulin did very little to actually solve this illness. Morell, being the bona fide quack that he was, began injecting Hitler with various animal hormones and organ extracts. From liver extracts to animal testosterone, Morell was injecting Hitler with things you would more expect to see amateur bodybuilders injecting to try and gain some kind of competitive edge. Out of all of Hitler's possible ailments at this time, like his basically confirmed irritable bowels, the possibility of him having diseases like syphilis, Huntington's disease, and/or Parkinson's disease, and even the possibility that he was suffering from the effects of a mustard gas attack that he suffered back in the First World War, the hormonal treatments that Morell was administering was rather dubious and questionable, to say the least. All the while, the quote-unquote vitamins that Morell had been injecting Hitler with over the past several years would have less of an effect over time. The body adjusts to things that you take in, you see, like how an alcoholic could down a pint of whiskey without any real issue, but a new drinker may feel significant effects after just a couple shots. This means that the frequency or intensity of the injections would have to increase to reach the same effect. It eventually got to the point with Morell injecting Hitler with ever-increasing levels of vitamins that Hitler needed injections or oral dosages of tranquilizers, sedatives, morphine, and/or Eucadol, which was just another name for oxycodone. This led to a continuous habit of Hitler needing injections and various oral medications just to basically exist as he wanted to. Hitler's physical condition would then take a major hit, and his drug issues would worsen in July 1944 after a failed assassination attempt. While Hitler would walk away with relatively minor injuries with various cuts and bruises, some ruptured eardrums, and some swelling on one of his arms, this seemed to coincide with a pretty major shift in his health overall. For one, Hitler had been suffering from tremors for quite a few years at this point. It's part of the reason why people suspect that he may have had Parkinson's, but after the assassination attempt, the tremors appeared to increase in frequency and severity. Hitler was also prescribed cocaine eardrops for his ruptured eardrums, which, for a man addicted to several drugs already, probably wasn't a great thing. Hitler would later develop jaundice in September 1944. This is where that doctor brought in tested the gas pills and found them to be harmful and, in all likelihood, the cause of his jaundice. When not injected with the various drugs that he was now taking on a daily basis, observers noticed that Hitler was a complete shell of his former self. The energy he had in his youth was now gone. The fiery, passionate, and hateful man was now replaced with a quiet, shaking, and seemingly empty man. In what is possibly the last photo ever taken of him on April 20th, 1945, his 56th birthday and just 10 days before his suicide, we see him looking at the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, seemingly being physically helped up by someone else. Shortly before his suicide, Hitler would allow everybody who wanted to leave his secret bunker to leave, and after allowing all of them to leave, Hitler would die a broken man likely suffering from severe drug withdrawals, as Morell himself was granted permission to leave and did. Morell, after fleeing Germany and now having lost everything, would also die 3 years later a poor, broken man. Morell would receive no punishment from the Allied criminal trials as he wasn't really involved in the Nazi government in that manner, but losing everything that he had seemingly turned him into a husk of his former self, and his health was rapidly fading, and he would die in a care center in Bavaria in 1948. So, with all that being said, let's go back and answer some of those questions that I added earlier. How did his addiction to injections and various drugs come about? Well, it came as a result of his introduction to Theodore Morell and subsequent trust in his medical care. Was it just a single drug or something more? It was all manner of drugs, both oral and injected drugs, methamphetamine, opioids, cocaine, and all manner of hormones and animal extracts. Realistically, at some point, what wasn't he addicted to? Who is to blame for his drug addiction? Well, in some sense, I think both Morell and Hitler are to blame, but for different reasons. Of course, Morell gave Hitler all manner of addictive drugs, so he was the drug peddler that maintained Hitler's supply. But in a different way, Hitler himself was also kinda to blame. Recall that from earlier that Hitler's mother died as a result of her cancer treatment. I think it's possible that this may have caused Hitler to have a sort of distrust for more conventional doctors. As Morell was considered by many to be a quack doctor, he wasn't your standard typical doctor in Germany. After this man, viewed as unconventional and perceived poorly by many in his field, he successfully made Hitler feel better in 1936, and perhaps it made Hitler think that finally, there is a real doctor that understands how to treat him. Perhaps this man, shunned by his peers as Hitler had been during his vagrant years after the war, sparked in Hitler a sense of compassion and relatability. Of course, this is just some armchair psychoanalysis on my part, but I do think it may be plausible. And on our final question, what was the result of his addiction? Well, we already went over that. It hurt him much more than it helped him, and it left him a broken husk of a man. And on that note, I think we'll go ahead and stop for today. So, thank you all for watching the video. Of course, remember to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and don't do drugs. Remember what Dare said, right? I don't. I don't think Dare was really a thing anymore when I was in school. It had a cool logo, though. Good for a t-shirt. Anywho, I hope you liked the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.